Let's talk about relative clauses. Relative clauses are clauses that begin with one of these relative pronouns. Who, whom, that, which, whose, when, where. Now, relative clauses have two main purposes. The first purpose is that they define or identify the noun that precedes them, or the noun that comes before them. Let me give you a few examples. Can I have the pen that I gave you last night? That I gave you last night is a relative clause. Do you know the girl who started going to our school yesterday? Who started going to our school yesterday is the relative clause. A laptop is a computer which you can carry around in your backpack. I don't want to meet at a cafe whose coffee is so bad. I want to stay in a place where there are many historical sites. Monday was the day when I learned to drive a car. We also have a relative pronoun called whom, but we don't use it very often in normal English. It's a little bit more for Old English. An example would be, my science teacher is a person whom I like very much. But again, we don't use it very often in normal English. The main purpose, like I said, of a relative clause is to define or identify the noun that comes before it. So, the noun that comes before it is going to tell you which relative pronoun you should use. That is the most common relative clause starter that we have. It can be used both with people or with things. So, we use who, that, and whose if you're talking about a person. If you're talking about a thing or defining a thing, we use that or which or whose. Now, whose is a relative pronoun that we use when we are talking about possession. Whose is used in place of a possessive pronoun, and it must be followed by a noun. There's a boy in my class whose father is a professional soccer player. The boy is possessing his father in the sentence, and so because it's possessive, we use the possessive relative pronoun whose in this case. Like I said, whose can be used either with people or with things, but who can only be used with people, and which can only be used with things. But that can be used with either people or things and is not used for possessive. So because of that, that is the most common relative clause starter. Here are some examples. We could say, do you know the boy who I saw last night? Or, do you know the boy that I saw last night? Either one is okay, and they have the same meaning. Now, for objects, we would use which, not who. So for example, do you have a phone which can use Bluetooth? Or, do you have a phone that can use Bluetooth? Either one is okay, and they have the same meaning. Now, when and where are less common relative pronouns, but we still use them, and we use them when we're talking about time or place nouns. So for example, Harvard is a school where students from around the world are educated. Or, 2001 was the year that terrorists attacked the World Trade Center in New York City. We identify the when and where, the time and place of the noun that precedes these relative clauses by using when and where. The second purpose of relative clauses is to give extra information about the preceding noun or the noun that comes before it. This information does not identify or define the noun as the previous examples, but it just gives information that is not necessary to understanding the meaning of the sentence. Now, let me give you some examples of relative clauses that give extra information about the noun that comes before them. My history professor, who came to Turkey in 1979, loves visiting historical sites. My father's company, which makes tablets, is moving from New York to Los Angeles. Over winter break, I'm going to visit my sister who lives in Canada. Now, the thing to understand about all these sentences is that the information you're giving is not necessary to understanding the meaning of the sentence. In the examples we talked about earlier that define or identify the noun that comes before the relative clause, you need that information to understand the sentence. So one of the examples we talked about before was, "Can you hand me the pen that I gave you last night?" Now, you need to understand which pen I'm talking about. I'm talking about the pen that I gave you last night. It's a specific pen, and so that information is needed in the sentence. But if I say, "My history professor who came to Turkey in 1979 loves visiting historical sites," the relative clause, "who came to Turkey in 1979, is not needed in the sentence to understand the meaning. You could simply say, "My history professor loves visiting historical sites." Now, relative clauses that give extra information are separated off by commas when used in writing. But when we're speaking, you can't really tell the difference. But the biggest reason to know the difference between relative clauses that are defining the noun that comes before them, as opposed to relative clauses that give extra information, is the way we use the pronoun that. Because if we're talking about a relative clause that gives extra information about a person, we can't use the pronoun that. For example, this sentence is not okay to say in English. Neil Armstrong, that was born in 1930, was the first man to set foot on the moon. We have to use the relative pronoun who in this sentence. So it should be Neil Armstrong, who was born in 1930, was the first man to set foot on the moon. Now, remember, for relative clauses that identify the noun that comes before them, it's okay still to use who or that. And so, for example, "That is the woman that I talked to yesterday" is okay. "That is the woman who I talked to yesterday" is also okay, because those relative clauses define the noun that comes before them. But if the relative clause gives extra information and it's about a person, you can only use who. One of the most tricky things for non-native English speakers is to know when to leave out the relative pronoun, or when you can leave out the relative pronoun that starts the relative clause. The most common time we leave out the relative pronoun is when the pronoun is the object of the relative clause. So for example, "Do you know the man who he's talking to?" We could also say, "Do you know the man he's talking to?" and leave out who, the relative pronoun, because in the sentence, it's functioning as an object in the relative clause. Another example is, "I haven't read any of the books that I got for my birthday last year." We can leave that out of the sentence. "I haven't read any of the books I got for my birthday last year." Now, this is tricky to understand, so we'll give some pictures in a second. But let's first talk about when you can't take out or omit the relative pronoun. If you're talking about a sentence that has a non-defining or extra information relative clause, you can't take out the relative pronoun. And you also can't take out the relative pronoun if it's the subject of the relative clause. You can only take it out if it's the object of the relative clause. Sometimes it's helpful to break up the sentence into two smaller sentences to figure out if the relative pronoun is functioning as the object or the subject of the sentence. Because in this sentence, "Do you know the man who he's talking to?" If man is functioning as the subject of the sentence, we can't take who out. But if it's functioning as the object, then it's okay to take who out, and the sentence will still make sense. So, "Do you know the man he's talking to?" can be broken up into these two sentences. He's talking to a man. Do you know him? In this sentence, man functions as the object of the sentence. And because of that, we can take who out of the sentence. So, for example, we could say, "Do you know the man he's talking to?" And that's still great in English. Now, let's try this sentence. Do you know the girl who started going to our school yesterday? We're trying to decide if the relative pronoun who can be taken out of the sentence. So we're going to break the sentence up into two shorter sentences. A girl started going to our school yesterday. Do you know her? Now we need to figure out, is girl functioning as the object or the subject in this new sentence? In this case, it's functioning as the subject. And because it's functioning as the subject, we need to keep who in the sentence. We can't say, do you know the girl started going to our school yesterday? We can't say that in English. We have to leave who in here because girl is the subject of the sentence. Now, the last situation that it's okay for you to take out the relative pronoun is if you have a present or past participle and an auxiliary verb to be. Now, that sounds really fancy, but it's a little bit more simple if we look at an example. Who is that man who is standing by the gate? We can take who is out of the sentence because it's functioning as a participle and the auxiliary verb to be. Because of that, it's okay to say, who is the man standing by the gate?